And now it looks like Lexie Hall is set out to be punished similar to Sophie Cunningham in today's game. We never got a real explanation from Stephanie White. Caitlin Clark has already been being sabotaged by this front office from day one.
The Indiana Fever walked out of Gainbridge Fieldhouse on Thursday night with a 114-106 overtime victory over the Chicago Sky. Aliyah Boston finished with 34 points and 12 rebounds. Caitlin Clark added 32 points and 10 assists. By the most visible measurement, it was a dominant performance. But a final score rarely tells the full story of how a team arrived at it, and in the case of this Indiana franchise, the distance between what happened on the floor and what the coaching staff allowed to happen tells a story that deserves a closer look. Clark and Boston made history Thursday night, becoming the first pair of teammates in WNBA history to each record a 30-point double-double in the same game. That is not a minor statistical footnote. That is a landmark moment in the history of the league, produced by two players who were both simultaneously operating at the highest level of professional basketball. The question worth asking is not simply whether Indiana won. The question is whether the coaching decisions surrounding that performance helped produce it, or whether it happened in spite of them. The answer, when you look at the sequence of events inside that game, is complicated. And the complication begins where it almost always does with this Fever team in 2026, with how Stephanie White manages the minutes and the moments that define close games. Indiana built a lead of 19 points during the first half. Chicago closed with a 14-2 run to get within 46-40 at halftime, then began the third quarter on a 16-7 run to take their first lead since it was 7-6. A 19-point lead converted into a deficit. That is not a variance in shot quality. That is not a hot shooting sequence from a team that eventually goes cold. That is a structural collapse, and structural collapses have structural causes. When Indiana held a comfortable cushion and the most gifted playmaker on the floor was operating at that level, the decision-making from the bench, when to deploy her, how to protect a lead, how to respond to a Chicago run, deserves scrutiny. By the end of regulation, Indiana had its lead trimmed to 96-93 with 18.9 seconds left before Clark made 2 free throws for a 5-point advantage. Then the Fever turned the ball over on an inbounds pass with 5.1 seconds remaining, and Skylar Diggins tied the game at 98 with a long three-pointer. An inbounds turnover with 5 seconds on the clock, a game that should have been sealed, reopened by an execution failure in the final possession of regulation. These are the kinds of moments that do not happen in isolation. They happen when a team's internal coherence, its trust in a system, its discipline under pressure has been eroded by inconsistency elsewhere. Overtime extended what regulation should have concluded. Chicago went 1 for 8 from the field in overtime, and Boston sealed the victory with 2 free throws after Sydney Taylor had briefly cut the margin to 3 with 24.1 seconds remaining. Indiana survived, but surviving a game you were leading by 19 is not the same as executing one. Now the broader context. The win moves Indiana to 7-5 on the season, and it represents back-to-back victories following the Washington trip. But the trajectory of this team over the first 12 games of the 2026 season has been marked by a recurring pattern that the results alone cannot obscure. It is a pattern that a significant portion of this fan base has identified, tracked, and grown increasingly frustrated by, and it centers on the coaching staff's relationship with the players who make this roster competitive. The most concentrated point of friction involves Lexie Hull. White said after the season opener that the plan for Hull was to manage her minutes carefully, given that Hull had missed all 3 preseason games with hamstring tightness. "We don't want to push it," White told reporters. "We want to make sure that we're ready and healthy." That explanation, in the context of an early May game, was reasonable on its face. But the pattern of limited deployment did not reset as Hull demonstrated her readiness. It continued. And it continued against teams and in moments where Hull's defensive profile and perimeter shooting make her one of the most valuable players Indiana can put on the floor. Sports columnist Jason Whitlock called out White directly after a loss to the Dallas Wings, writing that White does not appreciate what Lexie Hull provides the Fever. Whitlock's frustration was shared widely. Hull, a player who has built her value on defensive intensity and willingness to absorb physical contact, was seeing minutes distributed inconsistently while players with far shorter track records on this roster received longer looks. Thursday's game provided a partial corrective. Hull had 7 points and 4 rebounds through the first half, cleaning up on the backside as Indiana made 11 consecutive field goal attempts in the paint. She finished with 11 points for the game. That is a meaningful contribution. That is a player doing exactly what she is built to do, making contact, establishing position, and converting opportunities created by the primary offensive engine. When Hull is deployed with purpose and given the floor time to impose herself, the results are consistent. The argument from observers of this team is not that Hull is being misused in every game. The argument is that the decision-making around her rotation lacks a coherent philosophy, and that when Indiana loses control of leads the way they did in the third quarter Thursday, her absence from the floor at critical moments is part of the structural problem. The Portland Fire loss, a 184 defeat on May 31, was the clearest single illustration of this dynamic. With 6:30 remaining in the opening quarter, and with Indiana leading, White substituted Clark, Hull, and Aliyah Boston simultaneously. Indiana proceeded to unravel. By the end of the first quarter, Portland led 29-15, pulling all three of those players in a single substitution wave at a moment when the team had momentum requires a rationale that White's postgame explanation did not convincingly provide. White characterized the substitutions as workload management, calling them nothing out of the ordinary. The subsequent sideline exchange between Clark and White went viral. A short clip circulated showing what appeared to be an animated exchange between White and Clark during a huddle, after which White appeared to call Raven Johnson over to replace Clark. Hull, speaking publicly afterward, acknowledged the moment. "There's frustrations that rise, and decisions have to be made," she said, adding that it was not something that carried on beyond the game. That is the kind of measured response a veteran player gives when she is trying to protect the team's public image while navigating something that was clearly not resolved in the locker room as neatly as the phrasing suggests. Clark told reporters after the Portland loss that Indiana's rotations were a little bit slow in every coverage that we really tried. That is a careful phrase. When a player of Clark's stature describes the team's collective execution in those terms in a public setting, she is identifying a problem without assigning blame in a way that will generate a headline. But the implication is clear. A team whose rotations are consistently slow is a team that is not executing a system it fully believes in or fully understands. Following the Portland loss, the Fever held a 90-minute team meeting that the coaching staff initiated but became player-led. The players did not watch film from the Portland game during the session. Instead, they worked through internal dynamics. Veteran guard Kelsey Mitchell described the team's culture as being tested. "We needed that meeting," Sophie Cunningham said. "No one wants to have these meetings, but every team has them." That meeting clearly had an effect. The wins against Washington and Chicago followed. But the fact that a 90-minute internal conversation was necessary 8 games into the season, a conversation prompted by a pattern of dysfunction rather than a single bad night, reflects something more persistent than a team working through early season variance. It reflects a coaching environment that has not yet established the kind of operational trust that allows players to execute without second-guessing what comes next. The organizational context makes all of this harder to separate from the performance issues. The credential revocation of Fever beat reporter Scott Agnes, a journalist who had developed well-sourced relationships inside the organization over multiple seasons, removed one of the most reliable channels of information between the franchise and its fanbase at exactly the moment when transparency mattered most. The league warning over injury reporting practices added another layer of institutional opacity. These are not peripheral concerns. When a franchise manages information the way Indiana has managed it this season, the absence of clarity on the sideline becomes easier to understand as part of a broader organizational culture rather than an isolated coaching tendency. The Thursday overtime victory gave the Fever a 3-1 record in Commissioner's Cup play. Chicago dropped to 4-9 and has been eliminated from Commissioner's Cup contention. Indiana is winning more than it is losing. The talent on this roster, when given the opportunity to operate at its level, is among the most productive combinations in the WNBA. Clark is averaging 18, 7 points and 7.9 assists per game. Kelsey Mitchell is averaging 20.5 points. Boston is producing her most complete two-way basketball in years. But the team is also committing the most fouls in the league and allowing more free throw attempts per game than any other team. Indiana averages 24.4 fouls per game and allows opponents 25.8 free throw attempts per contest, with opponents connecting at an 80.3% rate. Those numbers are not coincidental. They reflect a defensive scheme that is either too complex, too reactionary, or insufficiently rehearsed for the players executing it. When Clark herself described the defensive rotations as slow in Portland, she was describing something that shows up directly in those foul numbers. Indiana is generating contact at the wrong end of the floor, giving opponents opportunities at the line rather than converting the physical aggression the roster is capable of into stops. The screen-setting problem compounds everything. Clark's ability to generate clean looks for herself and her teammates depends heavily on interior players making contact and absorbing the defensive disruption that frees her off the ball. When that contact is absent, when bigs slip screens early or fail to establish position before the ball handler attacks, the defense stays attached and the spacing collapses. The 19-point lead that Indiana surrendered in the second and third quarters, Thursday, was not the result of Clark failing. It was the result of the surrounding structure failing to protect what she created in the first half. Clark was 15 for 15 from the free throw line Thursday night. She also picked up her third technical foul of the season during the game. The technical foul pattern across 2026 is worth examining not as a disciplinary footnote, but as a behavioral indicator. Clark is not a player who accumulates technicals because she is emotionally undisciplined. She is a player who voices her frustration when she believes the officiating is inconsistent. In the context of a team that, by White's own public description, has faced officiating treatment she called egregious, a characterization she made after the Commissioner's Cup loss to New York. The accumulation of technicals by Clark suggests a player who is absorbing institutional pressure without adequate structural support around her. She is carrying that frustration on her own because the broader environment has not neutralized it. Indiana travels to Connecticut on Saturday. The Sun are a different type of opponent than the Sky. Connecticut is a team with structural defensive identity and the personnel to disrupt everything Indiana is trying to build on offense. The same rotation questions that defined Thursday's game will define Saturday's, and the coaching staff will again face the choice that has defined this season: deploy the players most capable of winning the possession, or manage around a philosophy that the results keep calling into question. The talent floor of this roster is extraordinary. Clark and Boston becoming the first pair of teammates in WNBA history to each post a 30-point double-double in the same game is not a minor historical distinction. It is evidence of what this team is capable of when its two best players are on the floor together and allowed to operate at the pace they create. The problem is not the players. It has never been the players. The problem is the infrastructure of decisions surrounding them, the rotation management, the substitution timing, the screen-setting discipline, the ball movement philosophy, the internal communication that turns what should be comfortable victories into overtime survival exercises. The Fever won Thursday. They have won 3 of their last 4. But a fan base that has watched this organization mismanage its most important talent window in a decade is not wrong to look at a 19-point lead that became a deficit, an inbounds turnover in the final seconds of regulation, and a third technical foul for the best player in the building, and ask whether any of that was necessary. The answer, when you watch this team honestly, is no. It was not necessary, and until the coaching staff can demonstrate that it has a consistent, defensible answer for how it uses its most important players in the moments that matter most, that question is not going away.